In the bitter cold of a Montana winter morning, snow crunched beneath worn leather boots as a young woman trudged through the muddy streets of Millbrook. Emma Walsh pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, one hand pressed protectively against the swell of her belly beneath her dark wool coat. The wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields beyond town. At 22, she had already buried a husband and watched her small savings dwindle to nothing as the harsh winter stretched on longer than anyone had expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the heavy wooden door, grateful for the warmth that greeted her inside. Margaret Stevens looked up from behind the counter, her sharp eyes immediately taking in Emma's condition and obvious need. The older woman had never been particularly kind to those she deemed beneath her station, and the pregnant widow of a mere blacksmith certainly fell into that category. Emma approached the counter with as much dignity as she could muster, despite knowing that her desperation was likely written across her face. She had practiced this conversation in her mind a dozen times during the sleepless night before, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavy on her tongue. The job posting she had seen nailed to the church door had been brief but promising: stable work needed, experience with horses required, fair wages offered. It had been signed simply with the initials CD and directions to inquire at Stevens' general store. Margaret Stevens studied her with the calculating gaze of a woman who had made it her business to know everyone else's affairs in the small frontier town. The silence stretched between them like a frozen creek, neither woman willing to be the first to break the ice that had formed around this moment of necessity meeting opportunity. The Montana Territory in 1885 was a land of contradictions, where fortunes could be made and lost as quickly as the weather could change from sunshine to blizzard. Millbrook had grown up around the promise of gold in the nearby Blackstone Mountains, but when the easy pickings ran out, the town had to reinvent itself or face the fate of so many other boom settlements that had become ghost towns scattered across the western landscape. Now it survived on cattle ranching, horse breeding, and the hope that the railroad would eventually choose their valley as a route to the Pacific coast. Emma Walsh had arrived in Millbrook 3 years earlier as the bride of Daniel Walsh, a skilled blacksmith whose strong hands could shape iron into anything the growing community needed. Their small house behind his workshop had been modest but comfortable, filled with the sound of his hammer on anvil and the warmth of a forge that never seemed to go cold. Daniel had been patient and kind, teaching her about horses and metalwork, showing her how to read the signs of lameness in a horse's gait, and how to mix the proper medicines for common ailments. Those skills had served her well during the 18 months since Daniel's death from pneumonia, allowing her to take in occasional work, tending to sick animals and helping with difficult births. But winter work was scarce, and her pregnancy had progressed to the point where many people considered it unseemly for her to be seen doing such labor. The baby was due in early spring, and Emma knew that without steady income, she would face the prospect of childbirth with no money for a doctor and no reserves to see her through the recovery period. The posting for stable work had appeared like an answer to prayer, though Emma had learned to be cautious about gifts that seemed too good to be true. In her experience, opportunities that promised fair wages usually came with complications that weren't immediately apparent. Still, her alternatives were limited to the point of non-existence, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Margaret Stevens finally broke the silence, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She informed Emma that the position was indeed still available, but warned that it would require working with some of the most spirited horses in the territory. The job was at Thunder Ridge Ranch, owned by Cole Davidson, a man whose reputation preceded him in ways both impressive and slightly intimidating. Emma had heard the name whispered in conversations around town, always with a mixture of respect and wariness that suggested Davidson was not a man to be taken lightly. He was described as uncommonly tall and powerfully built, with hands that could gentle the wildest bronco or break a man's jaw with equal ease. Some said he had come north from Texas after the war, bringing with him methods of horse training that bordered on mystical in their effectiveness. Others claimed he could read a horse's mind just by looking into its eyes. What everyone agreed upon was that Cole Davidson owned the largest and most successful ranch in 3 counties, running cattle and breeding horses that commanded premium prices as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. His operation supplied remounts to the cavalry and working horses to ranches throughout the region. The Thunder Ridge brand was synonymous with quality and reliability, which meant that employment there would provide not just income but also a reputation that could open doors in the future. Margaret Stevens explained that Davidson had specifically requested someone with experience in horse care and treatment, skills that were apparently more important to him than conventional expectations about what kind of work was appropriate for a woman in her condition. The wages offered were indeed fair, better than anything else available in the area, but the work would be demanding and would require living on the ranch property during the week. Emma listened to these details with a mixture of hope and trepidation, understanding that this opportunity represented her best chance for financial stability, but also recognizing that it would mean placing herself under the authority of a man she had never met. Her experience with Daniel had been positive, but she knew that not all men were inclined to treat women with respect and consideration, particularly women who found themselves in vulnerable circumstances. The more Margaret Stevens talked about the position, the more Emma sensed there were things being left unsaid, details about Cole Davidson or the ranch that might be relevant to her decision but were being carefully omitted from the conversation. There was something in the older woman's manner that suggested she had her own opinions about the wisdom of a pregnant widow taking employment at Thunder Ridge, but whether those concerns were based on genuine worry or mere disapproval of unconventional arrangements was impossible to determine. As Emma prepared to ask the practical questions about when she could apply for the position and what the application process would involve, the sound of heavy boots on the wooden walkway outside announced the arrival of another customer. The door opened with a blast of cold air that made everyone in the store shiver, and Emma turned to see a figure that seemed to fill the entire door frame. Cole Davidson was preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was indeed a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his heavy winter coat. His presence seemed to change the very atmosphere of the store, as if the air itself recognized his authority and rearranged itself accordingly. Dark hair showed beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and when he removed it in deference to the ladies present, Emma could see that his face was weathered by years of outdoor work but still handsome in a rugged, uncompromising way. His eyes found hers immediately, as if he had somehow sensed her interest in the position before she had even announced it. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and penetrating, and Emma felt as though he could see straight through to her thoughts and motivations. There was intelligence there, and calculation, but also something that might have been kindness if she was reading the signs correctly. Margaret Stevens performed the introductions with obvious reluctance, clearly preferring to avoid any direct involvement in what she probably considered an inappropriate arrangement. Cole Davidson acknowledged Emma with a slight nod, his attention focused entirely on her in a way that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, with just a trace of Texas drawl that suggested his origins lay somewhere far south of Montana. He asked direct questions about her experience with horses, listening carefully to her answers and occasionally asking for clarification about specific techniques or treatments. Emma found herself describing her work with Daniel, explaining how she had learned to diagnose common ailments and assist with difficult births. She mentioned her ability to read the subtle signs that indicated when a horse was favoring one leg or showing early symptoms of colic. Cole Davidson's questions revealed a depth of knowledge about horse care that impressed Emma despite her own expertise in the field. He clearly understood the complexities involved in maintaining the health of valuable breeding stock, and his inquiries suggested that he was looking for someone who could work independently rather than simply follow orders. This was both encouraging and intimidating, as it indicated a level of responsibility that would require her to make important decisions about expensive animals. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Margaret Stevens watching from behind her counter like a spectator at a boxing match, clearly hoping for some sign of how this unusual interview would conclude. Emma found herself responding to Cole Davidson's questions with more confidence than she had expected, her knowledge of horses and their care providing common ground that seemed to bridge the obvious differences in their circumstances. When he asked about her availability and willingness to live on the ranch during the work week, Emma hesitated only briefly before confirming that she could manage such an arrangement. The alternative was continued poverty and the very real possibility of facing childbirth without adequate resources, risks that far outweighed any concerns she might have about the propriety of the situation. Cole Davidson studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes seeming to weigh factors that were invisible to everyone else in the room. When he finally spoke, it was to offer her the position with a starting date of the following Monday, pending a brief trial period to ensure that her skills matched her claims. The wages he mentioned were exactly as advertised, fair compensation that would allow her to build a small reserve against future emergencies. Emma accepted the offer with gratitude that she hoped wasn't too obvious, though she suspected that her relief was probably written across her face in letters large enough for everyone to read. Cole Davidson shook her hand with surprising gentleness, his large fingers careful not to apply too much pressure to her smaller ones. There was something in his touch that suggested he was accustomed to handling delicate things with appropriate care. As he prepared to leave the store, Cole Davidson provided specific directions to Thunder Ridge Ranch and instructions about what she should bring for her first week of employment. He mentioned that Grace Miller, the woman who managed the domestic side of the ranch operations, would see to her accommodations and meals. Emma would be working primarily with the breeding stock, focusing on the mares and foals that represented the future of the operation. After he left, the store seemed somehow smaller and less significant, as if his presence had temporarily expanded the boundaries of the space and his absence had allowed everything to contract back to its normal dimensions. Margaret Stevens busied herself with unnecessary tasks, clearly processing what she had witnessed and formulating the opinions that would undoubtedly be shared with other members of the community before the day was over. Emma left the store with a mixture of emotions churning in her chest like water in a mountain stream during spring runoff. Relief at securing employment was tempered by uncertainty about what working for Cole Davidson would actually entail. She had the distinct impression that there were depths to the man that she had only glimpsed during their brief conversation, complexities that would reveal themselves over time as their working relationship developed. The walk back to her small house gave her time to consider the practical implications of her new position. She would need to arrange her affairs in town to accommodate being away during the week, ensuring that her few possessions would be secure and that her small garden plot would be properly tended during her absence. More importantly, she needed to prepare mentally for the challenge of proving herself capable in a demanding job while managing the physical limitations imposed by her advancing pregnancy. As she reached her front door, Emma paused to look back toward the center of town, where smoke rose from chimneys and the sounds of daily commerce continued despite the bitter cold. In a few days, she would be living in a different world, surrounded by the vastness of Thunder Ridge Ranch and working under the watchful eye of Cole Davidson. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, representing a chance for financial security but also placing her in circumstances that were entirely outside her previous experience. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if sensing the significance of the day's events and responding to her mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Emma pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the strong movements that reminded her of what was at stake in this decision. She was no longer making choices just for herself but for the child who would depend on her for everything from basic survival to future opportunities. That evening, as she sat by her small fire and planned for the week ahead, Emma allowed herself to hope that this opportunity might represent more than just temporary employment. Perhaps working at Thunder Ridge Ranch would provide not only immediate income but also connections and experiences that could lead to longer-term security. The reputation of the Davidson operation was strong enough that association with it might open doors that would otherwise remain closed to a woman in her circumstances. Part 2, Mysterious Benefactor Appears. Monday morning arrived with a clarity that only comes after fresh snowfall. The world transformed into something crystalline and achingly beautiful. Emma had risen before dawn to prepare for her first day at Thunder Ridge Ranch, packing her few belongings into a worn leather satchel that had belonged to Daniel. The weight of the bag seemed insignificant compared to the weight of expectation and uncertainty that pressed against her chest as she made her way through the quiet streets of Millbrook. The directions Cole Davidson had provided led her past the last of the town's buildings and onto a well-maintained road that wound through stands of pine and aspen toward the foothills of the Blackstone Mountains. The morning air was sharp enough to make her lungs ache, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the nervous energy that seemed to pulse through her veins with each step that carried her closer to her new employment. Thunder Ridge Ranch revealed itself gradually as she crested a low hill, the buildings emerging from the landscape like something that had grown there naturally rather than being imposed upon the terrain. The main house was larger than she had expected, a two-story structure built from local stone and timber that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Outbuildings were arranged with obvious care for both function and appearance, creating a compound that looked capable of weathering anything the Montana winters could devise. What struck Emma most forcefully was the sense of order and purpose that seemed to emanate from every aspect of the operation. Fences were straight and well-maintained, gates hung properly on their hinges, and even the snow-covered corrals showed evidence of careful planning and regular maintenance. This was clearly the domain of someone who understood that attention to detail was the foundation of long-term success. The sound of her footsteps on the hard-packed snow of the main yard brought a woman to the door of what appeared to be the kitchen entrance. Grace Miller was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of steady, competent air that suggested she had been managing complex households for decades. Her greeting was warm but reserved, the cautious friendliness of someone who had learned to withhold judgment until experience provided sufficient evidence. Grace led Emma through a brief tour of the domestic areas, explaining the routines and expectations that governed daily life at Thunder Ridge. Meals were served at specific times, with accommodation made for the varying schedules of ranch work. Emma would have a small but comfortable room in a building that housed several of the female employees, with access to washing facilities and a common area where the women could gather during their free time. The efficiency of the arrangements impressed Emma almost as much as their thoughtfulness. Someone had clearly given considerable attention to creating living conditions that would attract and retain good workers, understanding that comfortable employees were productive employees. The attention to detail extended beyond mere functionality to include small touches that made the spaces feel welcoming rather than merely utilitarian. Grace explained that Cole Davidson had built his operations reputation not just on the quality of his horses but on his ability to attract and keep skilled workers who shared his commitment to excellence. The ranch employed nearly 30 people on a permanent basis, with additional hands brought in during busy seasons. The diversity of the workforce was striking, including experienced cowboys from Texas, horse trainers from Kentucky, and even a few former cavalry soldiers who understood the specific requirements of military mounts. As they walked toward the main stable complex, Grace provided Emma with background information about the ranch's operations and Cole Davidson's approach to horse breeding. The program focused on producing animals that combined the hardiness necessary for frontier conditions with the refinement that commanded premium prices in established markets. Every breeding decision was made with multiple generations in mind, building toward horses that would maintain their value and performance across varying conditions and demands. The stable buildings themselves were impressive examples of functional architecture, designed to provide optimal conditions for valuable breeding stock while allowing efficient workflow for the people who cared for them. Wide aisles accommodated equipment and provided safety margins when handling spirited animals. Individual stalls were spacious enough to prevent injury while maintaining the security necessary for valuable horses. Ventilation systems ensured proper air circulation without creating drafts that could compromise the health of animals or workers. Emma's first glimpse of the horses themselves took her breath away despite her years of experience with various breeds and bloodlines. The animals in the breeding program represented the culmination of careful selection and patient development, each one a testament to Cole Davidson's understanding of equine genetics and conformation. Mares moved with the fluid grace that indicated proper bone structure and muscle development, while stallions displayed the controlled power that marked superior breeding prospects. Grace introduced Emma to Tom Bennett, the ranch foreman who would serve as her immediate supervisor and primary contact for work-related matters. Bennett was a weathered man in his 40s whose quiet competence suggested decades of experience with horses and the people who worked with them. His initial assessment of Emma was thorough but fair, focusing on her knowledge and capabilities rather than making assumptions based on her condition or circumstances. The conversation that followed revealed the scope of Emma's responsibilities and the expectations that would govern her employment. She would be working primarily with the broodmares, monitoring their health and condition throughout their pregnancies and assisting with foaling when necessary. The work required not just technical knowledge but also the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of observation and experience with equine behavior. Bennett explained that Cole Davidson had specifically requested someone with the ability to work independently and make sound decisions under pressure. The breeding program operated on schedules that didn't accommodate delays or mistakes, and the value of the animals involved meant that errors in judgment could have serious financial consequences. Emma would be expected to maintain detailed records of each animal's condition and progress, providing the documentation necessary for breeding decisions and health management. The first few hours of Emma's employment were spent in careful observation and assessment, allowing her to become familiar with the individual animals and their specific needs. Each mare had her own personality and preferences, quirks that needed to be understood and accommodated in order to provide optimal care. Some were nervous and required patient handling, while others were bold to the point of aggression and needed firm but respectful management. Emma found herself drawing on every aspect of her experience with horses, from the basic handling techniques Daniel had taught her to the more sophisticated diagnostic skills she had developed through necessity and observation. The quality of the animals she was working with demanded a higher level of care than she had previously provided, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Horses were individuals who responded best to consistent, knowledgeable handling that respected their nature while maintaining appropriate boundaries. By midday, Emma had begun to understand why Cole Davidson had been willing to hire a pregnant woman for demanding physical work. The position required knowledge and judgment more than raw strength, though there were certainly aspects of the job that would become more challenging as her pregnancy progressed. The ranch's emphasis on quality over quantity meant that the work was intensive but not overwhelming, focused on providing excellent care for a manageable number of animals rather than basic maintenance for large herds. Lunch was served in a common dining area where Emma had her first opportunity to interact with other ranch employees in a relaxed setting. The conversation was wide-ranging and surprisingly sophisticated, touching on topics from breeding theory to market conditions to political developments that might affect the territory's future. These were clearly people who took their work seriously and understood the broader context in which their efforts operated. The afternoon brought Emma's first direct interaction with Cole Davidson since their initial meeting in town. He appeared in the stable area with the quiet authority that seemed to be his natural state, moving among the animals with the confidence of someone who had spent decades perfecting his understanding of horse psychology and behavior. His presence seemed to have a calming effect on even the most spirited animals, suggesting that his reputation for almost mystical communication with horses had some basis in reality. Davidson's inspection of Emma's work was thorough but unobtrusive, allowing him to assess her capabilities without interfering with her developing relationship with the animals. He asked occasional questions about her observations and conclusions, clearly testing her knowledge while also gathering information that would inform his own decisions. Emma found herself responding with confidence born of genuine expertise, her years of experience providing answers that satisfied his rigorous standards. The conversation that developed between them revealed depths to Cole Davidson's character that had not been apparent during their brief meeting in town. His questions demonstrated not just technical knowledge but also a philosophical approach to animal husbandry that treated horses as partners rather than mere commodities. He spoke of breeding decisions in terms of building relationships between bloodlines, creating animals that would carry forward the best characteristics of their ancestors while adapting to changing requirements and conditions. Emma discovered that Davidson's approach to ranch management extended beyond horses to encompass every aspect of the operation. He understood that success depended on the coordination of multiple complex systems, from animal care to financial management to relationships with suppliers and customers. His questions about her observations revealed a mind that processed information from multiple sources and synthesized it into decisions that considered both immediate needs and long-term consequences. As the afternoon progressed, Emma began to understand that her employment at Thunder Ridge represented more than just a job opportunity. The ranch operated as a complete ecosystem, with each component designed to support and enhance the others. Her role in caring for the broodmares was part of a larger enterprise that touched every aspect of horse breeding and marketing, from genetic selection to customer service. The complexity of the operation became more apparent as Davidson explained the various programs and initiatives that comprised the ranch's activities. In addition to breeding horses for sale, Thunder Ridge maintained contracts with the military for remount supply, provided training services for horses purchased elsewhere, and operated a subsidiary business in leather goods and metalwork that utilized materials and skills available on the ranch. Emma's background in blacksmithing, acquired through her years with Daniel, proved unexpectedly relevant to several aspects of the ranch's operations. Davidson expressed particular interest in her knowledge of horseshoeing and metalwork, skills that were always in demand but difficult to find, combined with expertise in animal care. The conversation revealed possibilities for expanded responsibilities that could increase both her value to the operation and her potential earnings. The day concluded with Emma feeling simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated by the challenges and opportunities her new position presented. The work was indeed demanding, requiring constant attention and decision-making that drew on every aspect of her knowledge and experience. However, the quality of the animals and the sophistication of the operation made the effort rewarding in ways that went beyond mere financial compensation. Grace Miller's evening meal brought together employees from various aspects of the ranch's operations, creating an atmosphere that felt more like an extended family gathering than a simple workplace dining arrangement. Conversations ranged from technical discussions about specific animals to broader topics concerning the territory's development and the challenges facing frontier communities. Emma found herself welcomed into these discussions with a warmth that surprised her, given her status as both a newcomer and someone whose circumstances might have made others uncomfortable. The ranch employees seemed to share Davidson's focus on competence and character rather than conventional social distinctions, creating an environment where contributions were valued regardless of their source. As she settled into her modest but comfortable quarters for the night, Emma reflected on the unexpected complexity of what she had assumed would be straightforward employment. Thunder Ridge Ranch operated according to principles that went beyond simple profit maximization, encompassing ideas about community, quality, and long-term sustainability that elevated the enterprise above mere commercial transaction. The sounds of the ranch settling into evening routines provided a peaceful backdrop for Emma's contemplation of her new circumstances. In the distance, horses moved quietly in their stalls, and the occasional sound of conversation from other buildings suggested the continuation of the community that had welcomed her so readily. For the first time since Daniel's death, Emma felt herself part of something larger than mere survival, connected to an enterprise that offered both immediate security and future possibilities. Part 3. First Offer and Proud Rejection. The second day at Thunder Ridge Ranch dawned with the kind of brutal cold that made even experienced Montana residents appreciate the value of warm shelter and hot coffee. Emma woke in her small but comfortable room to the sound of activity already beginning throughout the ranch complex, the stirring of a community that started each day before the sun had fully committed to making an appearance. Her muscles ached from the previous day's work in ways that reminded her how long it had been since she had engaged in sustained physical labor. The pregnancy added an additional layer of complexity to every movement, requiring her to constantly adjust her balance and approach to tasks that had once been automatic. Still, the satisfaction of working with quality animals in a well-organized operation more than compensated for the physical demands. Grace Miller had coffee ready in the kitchen when Emma arrived for breakfast, along with a substantial meal that spoke to the ranch's understanding that hard work required proper nutrition. The other women who shared the employee quarters were already gathering around the large table, their conversation a mixture of work planning and gentle gossip that helped ease the transition from sleep to the demands of another challenging day. Emma learned that several of her colleagues had been working at Thunder Ridge for years, choosing to remain despite opportunities elsewhere because of the ranch's reputation for fair treatment and the satisfaction that came from being part of a superior operation. Their loyalty to Cole Davidson was evident in their conversations, based not on sentiment but on respect for his competence and appreciation for the working conditions he provided. The morning's work began with a comprehensive check of all the brood mares, assessing their condition and monitoring any changes that might indicate developing problems or approaching foaling dates. Emma found herself drawing on every aspect of her experience with horses, from basic health assessment to the more subtle indicators that suggested emotional or physical stress. One mare in particular caught her attention, a beautiful bay whose normally bright demeanor seemed subdued and whose appetite had apparently decreased over the past few days. The changes were subtle enough that they might have been overlooked by someone less experienced, but Emma's years of working with horses had taught her to pay attention to variations that might seem insignificant to casual observers. Tom Bennett was receptive to Emma's concerns about the mare, listening carefully to her observations and asking questions that demonstrated his own considerable knowledge of equine health and behavior. Together they conducted a more thorough examination of the animal, looking for physical signs that might explain the behavioral changes Emma had noted. The examination revealed nothing obviously wrong, but both Emma and Bennett agreed that continued monitoring was warranted. The mare was due to foal within the next few weeks, making any deviation from normal behavior particularly significant. They established a schedule for increased observation and documented their findings in the detailed records that Cole Davidson required for all breeding animals. The incident provided Emma with her first real test of working relationships at Thunder Ridge, and she was pleased to discover that her observations were taken seriously and acted upon appropriately. Bennett's willingness to trust her judgment spoke well of both his own competence and the ranch's commitment to utilizing all available expertise regardless of its source. Mid-morning brought Cole Davidson to the stable area for his daily inspection of the breeding program. His presence had the same effect on the animals as Emma had observed the previous day, a calming influence that seemed to reduce stress and encourage cooperation. She watched him move among the horses with fluid grace that suggested decades of experience reading animal psychology and responding appropriately to individual personalities. Davidson's attention focused immediately on the mare Emma and Bennett had identified as requiring special monitoring. His examination was thorough but gentle, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he assessed the animal's condition. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of his knowledge and the systematic approach he brought to animal husbandry. Emma found herself impressed by Davidson's willingness to consider multiple possibilities and his insistence on gathering additional information before making definitive conclusions. His questions about the mare's history and previous pregnancies demonstrated the kind of comprehensive thinking that had built Thunder Ridge's reputation for excellence. The discussion expanded to include broader topics related to equine health and breeding management, with Davidson clearly testing Emma's knowledge while also sharing insights derived from his extensive experience. She discovered that his approach to horse breeding incorporated elements of both art and science, combining empirical observation with theoretical understanding in ways that produced consistently superior results. As the conversation continued, Emma began to understand that Davidson's success was based on more than just technical expertise. His ability to synthesize information from multiple sources and make decisions that balanced competing priorities had allowed him to build an operation that prospered even during challenging economic conditions. The ranch's focus on quality over quantity had created a sustainable business model that weathered market fluctuations better than operations based on volume production. Davidson's questions about Emma's background revealed his interest in her previous experience with blacksmithing and metalwork. He explained that Thunder Ridge maintained its own forge and smithy operation, both for the practical needs of the ranch and as a service to neighboring operations. The combination of horse expertise and metalworking skills was particularly valuable, as it allowed for specialized work that most ranches had to contract out at considerable expense. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Davidson mentioned that the ranch's current blacksmith was planning to return to his family in Colorado within the next few months. The position would become available at precisely the time when Emma's pregnancy would make stable work more challenging, potentially offering her an alternative form of employment that would accommodate her changing circumstances. Emma's initial response was one of gratitude mixed with surprise at the generosity of the offer. The smithy position would provide steady work that was less physically demanding than stable duty while still utilizing her specialized knowledge and skills. The wages mentioned were comparable to her current employment, with the additional advantage of work that could be scheduled around the needs of a new mother. However, as she considered the implications of Davidson's offer, Emma found herself experiencing an unexpected resistance to accepting what appeared to be an ideal solution to her employment challenges. The suggestion, no matter how kindly meant, felt too much like charity disguised as opportunity. Her pride, carefully maintained throughout months of financial struggle, bristled at the notion of being provided with convenient alternatives because of her condition. Davidson seemed to recognize her internal conflict without requiring explanation, his gray eyes reading the subtle changes in her expression with the same attention he brought to assessing horses. He assured her that the offer was based on her qualifications rather than sympathy, pointing out that the combination of horse knowledge and metalworking skills was genuinely rare and valuable. Despite his reassurances, Emma found herself unable to immediately accept what would have solved many of her practical problems. The independence she had fought so hard to maintain seemed threatened by arrangements that were too convenient, too perfectly suited to her circumstances. Her experience had taught her to be suspicious of solutions that appeared to address all her concerns without requiring significant sacrifice or compromise. The conversation ended with Davidson encouraging Emma to consider the possibility without feeling pressured to make an immediate decision. He pointed out that the current blacksmith would be remaining for several more months, providing time for careful consideration and proper training if she chose to pursue the alternative position. Emma spent the remainder of the morning wrestling with her conflicted feelings about Davidson's offer. The practical advantages were undeniable, offering her a path toward continued employment that would accommodate both her pregnancy and the demands of early motherhood. The work would utilize skills she possessed and enjoyed, while providing income sufficient to maintain her independence. Yet something about accepting the position felt like admission of weakness, acknowledgement that she was unable to manage the challenges of her circumstances without special accommodation. The fierce independence that had sustained her through the most difficult periods of her life rebelled against solutions that seemed to make things too easy. Lunch conversation with her fellow workers provided additional perspective on Davidson's character and motivations. Several of the women had benefited from his willingness to provide alternative employment arrangements during various personal challenges, and all spoke of his ability to identify solutions that served both individual needs and ranch operations. Grace Miller, in particular, shared her own experience of being hired during a period when few ranches would have considered employing a woman in a supervisory capacity. Davidson's focus on competence rather than convention had provided her with opportunities that might not have existed elsewhere, allowing her to build a career based on her abilities rather than social expectations. The afternoon brought Emma face to face with the physical realities that made Davidson's offer increasingly relevant to her situation. The demands of stable work were beginning to test her stamina in ways that would only become more challenging as her pregnancy progressed. Simple tasks required more effort and planning, while activities that involved lifting or sustained standing became noticeably more difficult. Tom Bennett's careful attention to her capabilities reflected the ranch's commitment to employee safety, but also highlighted the growing limitations that would eventually make her current position untenable. His suggestions for modified duties and alternative approaches to certain tasks were helpful, but they also underscored the practical wisdom of Davidson's offer. The evening meal provided another opportunity for Emma to observe the complex dynamics that governed ranch operations. Davidson's presence at the table was natural rather than ceremonial, suggesting that his leadership style emphasized participation rather than separation. The conversations that flowed around him revealed employees who felt comfortable expressing opinions and offering suggestions, evidence of an environment that valued input from multiple sources. Emma found herself studying Davidson with new attention, trying to understand the motivations behind his offer of alternative employment. His interactions with other employees suggested that such arrangements were not unusual at Thunder Ridge, part of a management philosophy that recognized the value of retaining good workers through changing circumstances. The complexity of her feelings about the blacksmith position became a source of internal debate that continued long after the evening's activities had concluded. Pride warred with practicality, independence struggled against the reality of her circumstances, and suspicion of convenient solutions competed with recognition of genuine opportunity. As she prepared for sleep in her comfortable quarters, Emma reflected on the unexpected nature of her employment challenges. She had expected the work to be physically demanding and the social relationships to be complex, but she had not anticipated the psychological difficulties associated with accepting help that seemed too perfectly suited to her needs. The sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime routines provided a backdrop for her continued contemplation of Davidson's offer. In the distance, horses moved quietly in their stalls, and the occasional conversation from other buildings suggested the ongoing life of a community that had already begun to feel familiar. Emma's dreams that night were filled with images of forges and horses, of the workshop she had shared with Daniel, and the possibilities that Davidson's offer represented. The competing visions reflected her internal conflict between the security of accepting help and the satisfaction of maintaining complete independence, a struggle that would require resolution in the coming days. Part 4. Backstory and Emotional Stakes. The third morning at Thunder Ridge Ranch brought with it a conversation that would change Emma's understanding of both her employer and her own place in the complex dynamics of frontier life. Grace Miller had requested a private word with her before the day's work began, leading her to a small sitting area adjacent to the kitchen where they could speak without interruption. Grace's manner suggested that she had something significant to share, though whether it would be advice, warning, or simple information remained unclear. The older woman's expression carried the weight of experience and the careful consideration of someone who had learned to measure her words before speaking them aloud. The conversation began with Grace's observation that Emma seemed to be struggling with Cole Davidson's offer of alternative employment, despite its obvious practical advantages. Grace had observed many employees navigate similar decisions during her years at Thunder Ridge, and she recognized the signs of someone wrestling with pride and practicality in equal measure. What followed was a revelation that provided crucial context for understanding Davidson's character and motivations. Grace explained that Thunder Ridge Ranch had not always been the prosperous operation that Emma now observed, and Davidson's current success had been built upon a foundation of struggle and loss that shaped his approach to both business and personal relationships. Cole Davidson had arrived in Montana Territory 12 years earlier as a young man carrying little more than his knowledge of horses and the haunting memories of a war that had taken everything he had once valued. The Texas ranch where he had grown up had been destroyed during the final years of the conflict, his family scattered or killed, and his future reduced to whatever he could build with his own hands and determination. The early years of Thunder Ridge had been marked by the kind of grinding poverty and uncertainty that broke many frontier enterprises before they could establish themselves. Davidson had worked alone for the first several seasons, slowly building a herd of horses and a reputation for quality that eventually attracted the attention of buyers willing to pay premium prices for superior animals. Grace had arrived at Thunder Ridge during the ranch's third year of operation, hired as a cook and housekeeper when Davidson's success had finally reached the point where he could afford to employ additional help. She had witnessed firsthand the transformation of both the man and the operation, watching as prosperity gradually softened the hard edges that war and loss had carved into his character. The turning point had come during the ranch's fifth year, when Davidson had married a young woman named Catherine Brennan, whose father owned a successful general store in the territorial capital. Catherine had brought not only her own considerable domestic skills to the marriage, but also the social connections and business acumen that helped transform Thunder Ridge from a local operation into a regional enterprise. Grace's description of Catherine revealed a woman of remarkable capability and ambition who had understood the potential that Davidson's horse breeding program represented. Under her influence, the ranch had expanded beyond simple horse trading to encompass the complex marketing and breeding strategies that now commanded premium prices across the Western territories. The marriage had been genuinely happy, based on mutual respect and shared vision for what Thunder Ridge could become. Catherine's business sense had complemented Davidson's horsemanship, creating a partnership that had elevated the ranch to its current position of prominence and profitability. Their plans had included not just business expansion but also the establishment of a family that would carry forward their combined achievements. Those plans had been shattered 2 years earlier when Catherine had died in childbirth, taking with her both the child they had anticipated and the future they had so carefully constructed together. The loss had devastated Davidson in ways that went beyond simple grief, destroying his faith in the possibility of building anything lasting or meaningful. Grace's account of Davidson's response to his wife's death painted a picture of a man who had retreated into work as a defense against overwhelming loss. The ranch had continued to prosper under his management, but the vision and expansion that had characterized the Catherine years had been replaced by a focus on perfection within existing operations rather than growth toward new possibilities. The revelation explained much about Davidson's character that had puzzled Emma during their previous interactions. His combination of competence and isolation, his focus on quality over quantity, and his willingness to provide opportunities for others all reflected a man who had learned to find meaning in work while protecting himself against further emotional investment. Grace's decision to share this information with Emma was motivated by her observation that Davidson's behavior toward his newest employee differed from his usual pattern of maintaining professional distance. His offer of alternative employment and his obvious interest in her welfare suggested that something about Emma's circumstances had engaged his attention in ways that went beyond simple business considerations. The conversation continued with Grace's careful assessment of Emma's own situation and the challenges she would face in the coming months. The older woman's experience with frontier life had taught her to recognize the signs of someone operating without adequate support systems, and Emma's determination to maintain complete independence reminded her of other women who had paid high prices for pride. Grace spoke frankly about the realities of childbirth and early motherhood in a territory where medical assistance was limited and social support networks were often inadequate. Emma's plan to manage these challenges entirely on her own, while admirable in its determination, struck Grace as potentially dangerous for both mother and child. The discussion revealed aspects of Emma's background that she had not previously shared with anyone at Thunder Ridge. Her marriage to Daniel Walsh had been brief but profoundly happy, built on shared interests and mutual respect that had made his loss particularly devastating. Their plans for the future had been modest but meaningful, centered on building a blacksmith business that would serve the growing community while providing security for the family they hoped to create. Daniel's death from pneumonia had occurred with shocking suddenness, transforming Emma's life from comfortable stability to desperate uncertainty within a matter of days. The medical expenses associated with his final illness had consumed most of their savings, while the loss of his income had left her with few options for maintaining their modest household. Emma's pregnancy had been discovered several weeks after Daniel's death, adding complexity to an already difficult situation. The baby represented both a precious connection to her lost husband and an additional challenge that would make maintaining her independence even more difficult. Her determination to provide for her child without accepting charity had driven every decision she had made since Daniel's death. The conversation with Grace provided Emma with a new perspective on her own circumstances and the motivations behind Davidson's offer of alternative employment. Rather than representing charity or pity, the blacksmith position might reflect Davidson's understanding of the practical challenges she faced, and his recognition that her skills could benefit the ranch while providing her with sustainable employment. Grace's gentle suggestion that pride could become a form of selfishness when it prevented accepting help that would benefit both giver and receiver struck Emma with unexpected force. The idea that her insistence on complete independence might actually be a form of self-indulgence that ignored the welfare of her unborn child challenged assumptions she had not previously examined. The morning's work provided Emma with additional opportunities to observe Davidson's management style and the relationships he maintained with ranch employees. His interactions revealed a man who had learned to balance authority with genuine concern for the welfare of those who worked for him, creating an environment where people felt valued while maintaining the discipline necessary for efficient operations. Emma noticed that Davidson's attention to employee welfare extended beyond simple business considerations to encompass personal circumstances that might affect work performance. His inquiries about family situations and health concerns reflected genuine interest rather than mere politeness, suggesting that his offer of alternative employment was consistent with his general approach to personnel management. The midday meal brought Emma into contact with several employees who had been with Thunder Ridge during the Catherine years, their conversations providing additional insight into the transformation that had occurred following her death. Their descriptions of the earlier period revealed a ranch that had been characterized by expansion and innovation, driven by the combined vision of Davidson and his wife. The contrast with the current operation, while still highly successful, suggested that Davidson's focus had shifted from growth to perfection, from building toward the future to maintaining excellence in existing operations. The change reflected not just business strategy but also the psychological impact of loss on someone who had invested deeply in shared dreams and collaborative planning. Emma's afternoon work with the pregnant mares provided her with a powerful reminder of the risks associated with reproduction in environments where medical assistance was limited. The animals under her care would benefit from the ranch's resources and Davidson's commitment to providing optimal conditions, advantages that her own child might not enjoy if she insisted on managing her pregnancy and childbirth entirely alone. The parallel between her own situation and that of the valuable breeding stock was impossible to ignore. Davidson invested heavily in ensuring that his mares received the best possible care during pregnancy and foaling because he understood that the welfare of both mother and offspring depended on adequate support and professional attention. Emma's recognition that she might be applying different standards to her own pregnancy than she would recommend for valuable animals provided a sobering perspective on her decision-making process. The realization that pride might be preventing her from providing optimal conditions for her child's development challenged her assumptions about what constituted responsible parenting. The evening brought another conversation with Davidson, this time focused on technical aspects of horse breeding and the challenges of maintaining genetic diversity while pursuing consistent quality improvements. His questions about her observations and opinions revealed a mind that processed information from multiple sources and welcomed input from knowledgeable colleagues regardless of their official status. Emma found herself increasingly impressed by Davidson's intellectual approach to ranch management and his willingness to consider alternative perspectives on complex problems. His combination of practical experience and theoretical understanding had clearly contributed to Thunder Ridge's success and suggested that his offer of employment was based on genuine recognition of her capabilities. The conversation gradually shifted from technical topics to more personal subjects, with Davidson sharing insights into his philosophy of ranch management and his long-term vision for Thunder Ridge's development. His comments revealed a man who had learned to find satisfaction in incremental improvements and sustainable practices rather than dramatic expansion or rapid change. Emma sensed that Davidson's current approach to ranch management reflected lessons learned from both success and loss, a hard-won understanding of the balance between ambition and prudence. His focus on quality relationships with employees and customers suggested that he had learned to value stability and consistency over rapid growth or maximum short-term profits. As the evening progressed, Emma found herself beginning to understand that accepting Davidson's offer of alternative employment might represent an opportunity for mutual benefit rather than one-sided charity. Her skills and knowledge could genuinely contribute to the ranch's operations while providing her with employment that would accommodate her changing circumstances. The day concluded with Emma feeling more optimistic about the possibilities that lay ahead, though her fundamental concerns about maintaining independence remained unresolved. The conversation with Grace and her subsequent observations of ranch operations had provided her with important context for understanding Davidson's motivations and the potential benefits of accepting his offer. Her evening reflections included consideration of the parallel between her own situation and Davidson's response to loss and uncertainty. Both had experienced devastating changes that had forced them to rebuild their lives around new circumstances and altered expectations. Perhaps their mutual understanding of struggle and adaptation could provide the foundation for a working relationship that would benefit both parties. The sounds of the ranch settling into nighttime routines had become familiar and comforting, suggesting that her temporary employment was already beginning to feel like something more permanent and meaningful. The question that remained was whether she could overcome her resistance to accepting help long enough to build something sustainable for herself and her child. Part 5. Mounting Pressure. The fourth day at Thunder Ridge Ranch brought with it a series of challenges that would test Emma's resolve and force her to confront the growing limitations imposed by her advancing pregnancy. The morning began with unseasonably warm weather that turned the ranch's snow-covered grounds into a treacherous mixture of mud and ice, making every step potentially hazardous for someone whose balance was already compromised by the weight and bulk of carrying a child. Emma's assigned tasks for the day included a comprehensive health assessment of the entire breeding herd, work that required her to move between multiple buildings and spend extended periods examining animals in various stages of pregnancy. The physical demands of the job, which had seemed manageable during her first few days at Thunder Ridge, now presented challenges that she found increasingly difficult to navigate safely. The first indication of trouble came during her examination of a mare that had been showing signs of possible complications with her pregnancy. The animal, normally docile and cooperative, became agitated during the assessment, requiring Emma to maintain control while conducting a thorough examination in conditions that were far from ideal. The combination of slippery footing and an unpredictable horse created exactly the kind of dangerous situation that responsible ranch management sought to avoid. Tom Bennett's intervention prevented what could have been a serious accident, but his obvious concern about Emma's safety highlighted the growing conflict between her determination to fulfill her employment obligations and the practical realities of her condition. His suggestion that certain tasks might be better assigned to other workers was diplomatically worded but clearly motivated by genuine worry about her welfare. The incident forced Emma to acknowledge that her pregnancy was beginning to affect her ability to perform some aspects of her job safely and effectively. The realization was particularly difficult because it came at a time when she was finally beginning to feel confident about her place at Thunder Ridge and her ability to contribute meaningfully to the ranch's operations. Grace Miller's response to news of the morning's near accident was characteristically direct and practical. The older woman had witnessed too many frontier tragedies caused by people who refused to acknowledge their limitations, and she was not inclined to stand by quietly while Emma risked her safety and that of her unborn child. Their conversation after the midday meal was frank to the point of bluntness about the choices Emma faced. Grace pointed out that Emma's determination to maintain complete independence was beginning to resemble stubbornness rather than strength, particularly when it put both her and her child at unnecessary risk. The older woman's experience with frontier life had taught her to distinguish between admirable self-reliance and dangerous pride, and she was concerned that Emma was allowing the latter to override sound judgment. The conversation revealed additional pressures that Emma had not fully considered in her planning for the future. Winter in Montana Territory could extend well into spring, creating conditions that would make travel to town for medical assistance difficult or impossible when her pregnancy reached its final stages. The isolation that had seemed manageable during her first few days at Thunder Ridge could become life-threatening if complications arose during childbirth. Grace's description of previous winters and the challenges they had created for ranch operations provided sobering context for Emma's situation. Stories of employees trapped for weeks by severe weather, of supply lines cut and communication with the outside world reduced to infrequent messages carried by hardy individuals willing to brave extreme conditions, painted a picture of isolation that could prove dangerous for someone facing childbirth without adequate support. The afternoon brought Emma face to face with the growing gossip and speculation that her employment at Thunder Ridge had generated among the residents of Millbrook. Margaret Stevens arrived at the ranch unannounced, ostensibly to deliver supplies but clearly motivated by curiosity about Emma's living arrangements and working conditions. The store owner's questions and observations carried undertones of disapproval that reflected broader community concerns about the propriety of the situation. Emma discovered that her presence at Thunder Ridge had become a topic of considerable discussion in town, with opinions divided between those who admired her determination to support herself and those who questioned the wisdom of a pregnant woman working in such close proximity to an unmarried man of Cole Davidson's reputation and means. The speculation ranged from innocent concern for Emma's welfare to more malicious suggestions about the true nature of her employment arrangements. Margaret Stevens made no effort to disguise her fishing expedition for information, asking pointed questions about Emma's living quarters, her daily interactions with Davidson, and the specific nature of her work responsibilities. The older woman's manner suggested that she had appointed herself as a guardian of community morals with particular interest in situations that might provide material for scandalous gossip. Emma's responses were carefully measured, providing factual information about her work while avoiding details that might fuel further speculation. She emphasized the professional nature of her employment and the presence of multiple other workers at the ranch, particularly the women who shared her living quarters and could attest to the propriety of the arrangements. However, Margaret Stevens' visit made clear that Emma's decision to work at Thunder Ridge had consequences that extended beyond her immediate circumstances. The community's perception of her character and reputation would affect not only her own future prospects but also those of her child, who would grow up in a small town where memory was long and forgiveness was often grudgingly given. The realization that her employment choices were being scrutinized and judged by people who had no direct knowledge of her circumstances or motivations added another layer of pressure to an already complex situation. Emma found herself wondering whether her determination to maintain independence was worth the social costs that seemed to accompany her unconventional arrangements. Grace Miller's response to Margaret Stevens' visit was characteristically protective and direct. The ranch housekeeper had dealt with similar intrusions before and had little patience for busybodies who used moral concern as an excuse for satisfying their curiosity about other people's private affairs. Her dismissal of the store owner was polite but firm, making clear that Thunder Ridge Ranch did not welcome uninvited inspections of its personnel policies. The conversation that followed Margaret Stevens' departure provided Emma with additional insight into the social dynamics that surrounded frontier life and the particular challenges faced by women who operated outside conventional expectations. Grace's experience had taught her that community opinion could be both a source of support and a weapon of control, depending on how it was wielded and by whom. Grace explained that Thunder Ridge Ranch's reputation for fair treatment of employees had generally insulated it from the kind of criticism that might affect smaller or less successful operations. Davidson's standing in the community and the ranch's economic importance provided a degree of protection for unconventional employment arrangements, though that protection was not absolute and could be undermined by persistent gossip or deliberate troublemaking. The evening brought another unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. James Parker, the physician who served Millbrook and the surrounding ranches. His arrival was initially welcomed as a routine social call, but Emma soon realized that his visit had been prompted by concerns about her welfare and the adequacy of medical care available to her at the ranch. Parker's examination was thorough and professional, revealing a man who took his responsibilities to frontier families seriously and understood the particular challenges faced by pregnant women in isolated locations. His questions about Emma's health and the progress of her pregnancy were informed by years of experience with frontier medicine and the complications that could arise when professional assistance was not readily available. The physician's assessment was generally positive, finding both Emma and her unborn child to be in good health despite the stresses of recent months. However, his recommendations for the remainder of her pregnancy included restrictions on physical activity that would make continuing her current employment increasingly difficult and potentially dangerous. Dr. Parker's frank discussion of the risks associated with childbirth in frontier conditions provided sobering context for Emma's future planning. His description of complications that could arise during delivery and the limited resources available for addressing them highlighted the importance of having adequate support and preparation well before the expected delivery date. The conversation revealed that Dr. Parker had been contacted by concerned community members who worried about Emma's welfare and the appropriateness of her current living arrangements. While he made clear that his medical assessment was independent of any social considerations, his recommendations would inevitably influence community opinion about the wisdom of her continued employment at Thunder Ridge. Emma found herself caught between competing pressures that seemed to offer no clear resolution. The medical advice suggested that continuing her current work would become increasingly inadvisable, while her financial circumstances made alternative employment essential for her survival and that of her child. The community's growing interest in her situation added social pressure that complicated every decision she might make about her future. Cole Davidson's response to Dr. Parker's visit was characteristically thoughtful and measured. His conversation with the physician was private, but the outcome was a request for a meeting with Emma to discuss modifications to her employment that would address the medical concerns while maintaining her ability to earn the income she needed. The meeting took place in Davidson's office, a room that reflected both his success and his practical approach to business. The space was comfortable but not ostentatious, filled with books, maps, and records that spoke to the complexity of managing a large ranching operation. Emma found herself impressed by the evidence of careful planning and attention to detail that characterized every aspect of Thunder Ridge's operations. Davidson's proposal was both generous and practical, offering Emma a transition to work that would accommodate her changing physical capabilities while utilizing her knowledge and skills in ways that would benefit the ranch. The smithy position remained available, but he also suggested the possibility of taking on record-keeping and correspondence duties that would allow her to work primarily from indoors while maintaining her connection to the horse breeding program. The financial terms of Davidson's offer were more than fair, providing income sufficient to maintain her independence while accommodating the reality that her productivity would necessarily decrease as her pregnancy progressed. The arrangement included provision for time off during and after childbirth, with assurance that her position would remain available when she was ready to return to work. Emma's initial response was gratitude mixed with the familiar resistance to accepting arrangements that seemed too convenient and too generous. Her experience had taught her to be suspicious of solutions that appeared to solve all her problems without requiring significant sacrifice or compromise on her part. The offer seemed almost too good to be true, raising questions about Davidson's motivations and expectations. Davidson seemed to anticipate her concerns, addressing them directly with explanations that emphasized the mutual benefits of the proposed arrangement. He pointed out that Emma's knowledge of horses and metalworking represented valuable resources that the ranch could utilize profitably, making her continued employment a sound business decision rather than charitable gesture. The conversation revealed aspects of Davidson's character that Emma had only glimpsed during their previous interactions. His combination of practical business sense and genuine concern for employee welfare created an approach to management that balanced profit considerations with human decency in ways that were rare in frontier enterprises. Davidson's willingness to accommodate Emma's changing circumstances reflected broader principles that governed his approach to ranch operations. He understood that maintaining a stable workforce required flexibility and attention to individual needs, particularly in a frontier environment where skilled workers were scarce and difficult to replace. Emma found herself impressed by Davidson's ability to present business arguments for decisions that were clearly motivated by personal concern for her welfare. His skill at finding solutions that served multiple interests simultaneously suggested a sophistication in human relations that went beyond simple economic calculation. The meeting concluded with Emma requesting time to consider Davidson's proposals, though both participants understood that her options were limited by circumstances beyond her control. The combination of medical advice, community pressure, and practical necessity was rapidly narrowing her choices to accepting help or facing potentially dangerous consequences. Emma's evening reflections included careful consideration of the various pressures that were shaping her decision-making process. The medical concerns were real and could not be ignored without risking her health and that of her child. The community's growing interest in her situation added social complications that would affect her long-term prospects in Millbrook. Her financial needs remained pressing and would only become more urgent as her pregnancy progressed. The conversation with Davidson had revealed possibilities for maintaining her employment while addressing the practical challenges posed by her condition. His proposals offered not just immediate solutions but also longer-term security that could provide stability for her and her child well beyond the immediate crisis. Grace Miller's evening visit to Emma's quarters provided additional perspective on the choices she faced. The older woman's experience with frontier life had taught her to recognize when pride became counterproductive and when accepting help represented wisdom rather than weakness. Her advice was direct and practical, focusing on the welfare of Emma's unborn child rather than abstract principles of independence. Grace pointed out that Emma's child would benefit from growing up in an environment that provided security and opportunity, advantages that would be difficult to achieve if Emma insisted on managing every challenge entirely on her own. The child's welfare, Grace suggested, should take precedence over Emma's desire to maintain complete independence. The conversation included Grace's observations about Davidson's character and motivations, drawn from years of working closely with him and witnessing his responses to various challenges and opportunities. Her assessment was that his offers of modified employment were genuine expressions of concern combined with sound business judgment rather than attempts to create obligation or dependence. Grace's description of Davidson's response to his wife's death provided additional context for understanding his current behavior toward Emma. His experience with loss had taught him to value the people in his life and to act decisively when circumstances threatened their welfare. His offers of help reflected lessons learned from tragedy rather than casual generosity. The evening concluded with Emma feeling increasingly isolated by the competing pressures that surrounded her situation. The medical advice, community opinion, and practical necessities all pointed toward accepting Davidson's proposals, yet her determination to maintain independence continued to resist solutions that seemed to make things too easy. Emma's restless night was filled with dreams that mixed images of her life with Daniel, her uncertain future, and the complex figure that Cole Davidson had become in her daily existence. The dreams reflected her internal conflict between the security that accepting help would provide and the satisfaction that came from meeting challenges through her own efforts. The approaching dawn brought with it the understanding that her time for decision-making was running short. The combination of medical necessity, social pressure, and practical reality was creating a situation where further delay would constitute a decision in itself, one that might prove dangerous for both her and her child. Emma's morning preparations included recognition that the day ahead would likely bring another conversation with Davidson about her future at Thunder Ridge. The pressure to make a decision was becoming overwhelming, complicated by her growing awareness that her feelings about her employer were becoming more complex than simple gratitude for employment opportunities. The realization that her resistance to accepting Davidson's help might be influenced by her growing attraction to him added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The possibility that personal feelings were affecting her judgment about practical matters created new uncertainties about the wisdom of any decision she might make regarding her future employment. As Emma prepared to face another day of mounting pressure and difficult choices, she understood that her determination to maintain complete independence was being tested by circumstances that might prove stronger than her resolve. The question that remained was whether she could find a way to accept the help she needed while preserving enough of her autonomy to feel that she remained the author of her own destiny. Part 6. Breaking Point Crisis. The fifth morning at Thunder Ridge Ranch dawned with an ominous stillness that experienced Montana residents recognized as the precursor to severe weather. The air carried a metallic quality that seemed to press against the skin, and the horses moved restlessly in their stalls as if sensing atmospheric changes that human perception could not yet detect. Emma woke with a heaviness in her chest that she initially attributed to the approaching storm but which would prove to be connected to challenges far more personal than mere weather. Her morning routine had become increasingly difficult as her pregnancy progressed, each movement requiring conscious thought and careful planning to maintain balance and avoid strain. The simple act of dressing had become a complex negotiation between her expanding body and clothing that no longer fit properly. While the walk to the main ranch buildings required navigation of increasingly treacherous footing as the spring thaw created muddy patches that could trap an unwary foot. The breeding program's morning assessment revealed troubling developments that would test both Emma's expertise and her physical limitations. 3 of the pregnant mares were showing signs of distress that required immediate attention, while a fourth appeared to be entering the early stages of labor several weeks ahead of schedule. The situation demanded exactly the kind of intensive physical work that Dr. Parker had warned against, creating an impossible conflict between professional responsibility and personal safety. Tom Bennett's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct and practical. The mares required continuous monitoring and hands-on care that would involve hours of standing, kneeling, and potentially dangerous close contact with animals that were experiencing stress and discomfort. The work was essential for protecting valuable breeding stock, but it represented exactly the kind of physical demand that could trigger complications in Emma's own pregnancy. Emma's insistence that she could manage the required tasks despite her condition reflected both professional pride and growing desperation about her employment security. The thought of being unable to fulfill her responsibilities during a critical situation threatened her sense of competence and value to the ranch operation. Her determination to prove herself capable led her to minimize the risks and overestimate her current physical capabilities. The morning's work began with Emma attempting to maintain her normal pace and thoroughness despite obvious signs that the demands were becoming too much for her current condition. The combination of physical stress and emotional pressure created a dangerous cycle where increased effort led to greater strain, which in turn demanded even more careful attention to the animals under her care. Grace Miller's observation of Emma's struggle prompted several attempts to convince her to accept assistance or modify her approach to the crisis. But these suggestions were met with polite refusal based on Emma's conviction that accepting help would constitute professional failure. Her pride had become so invested in maintaining her independence that she could no longer distinguish between reasonable accommodation and unacceptable weakness. The first clear warning came when Emma experienced sharp pain while examining one of the distressed mares, a sensation that forced her to pause and acknowledge that something was seriously wrong with her own condition. The pain passed quickly, but its intensity and sudden onset suggested that her body was beginning to protest the demands she was placing upon it. Tom Bennett's immediate response was to suggest that Emma take a break and allow other workers to handle the more physically demanding aspects of the situation. But her refusal was adamant despite the growing evidence that continuing would be dangerous. Her insistence on maintaining her full responsibilities reflected both admirable dedication and stubborn disregard for obvious warning signs. The crisis escalated when one of the mares entered active labor with complications that required Emma's specific expertise in difficult births. The situation demanded immediate intervention that would involve sustained physical effort in uncomfortable positions. Exactly the kind of work that posed the greatest risk to someone in Emma's condition. Her knowledge was essential for saving both mare and foal, but applying that knowledge would require her to ignore every piece of medical advice she had received. Emma's decision to proceed with the assistance despite the risks reflected her understanding that some situations demanded personal sacrifice for the greater good. The value of the animals involved and the importance of maintaining Thunder Ridge's reputation for excellence created pressures that seemed to override concerns about her personal safety. The delivery proved even more difficult than anticipated, requiring Emma to work for hours in positions that strained her back and legs while managing a mare that was experiencing significant distress. The physical demands of the situation pushed her beyond her current capabilities. But her commitment to the animals under her care prevented her from stepping back even when the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Cole Davidson's arrival at the stable came at the moment when Emma's determination finally collided with her physical limitations.
She was kneeling beside the laboring mare when a wave of pain and dizziness struck with such force that she nearly collapsed, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the pressure of demands that had become too much to bear. Davidson's response was immediate and decisive, his large hands gentle but firm as he helped Emma to her feet and guided her away from the stall where other workers could take over the mare's care. His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument as he overruled her protests and insisted that her own welfare take precedence over any work responsibilities. The short walk to the ranch house became an ordeal that highlighted just how much Emma's condition had deteriorated during the morning's crisis. Each step required conscious effort, and the pain in her back had intensified to the point where maintaining an upright posture was becoming increasingly difficult. Davidson's support was the only thing that prevented her from collapsing before they reached the safety of indoor shelter. Grace Miller's reaction to Emma's obvious distress was a mixture of concern and frustration that someone so intelligent could have ignored such clear warning signs for so long. The older woman's experience with pregnancy and childbirth allowed her to recognize symptoms that suggested Emma had pushed herself to the point where serious complications were becoming likely. Dr. Parker's emergency call to Thunder Ridge Ranch resulted in his arrival just as Emma's condition was reaching a crisis point that could no longer be managed with rest and good intentions. His examination revealed that the morning's exertions had triggered early contractions and other symptoms that posed a genuine threat to both mother and child if not addressed immediately and professionally. The physician's assessment was delivered with the blunt honesty that frontier conditions demanded, making clear that Emma's insistence on continuing to work had created a situation where the survival of her pregnancy was now uncertain. The complications that had developed required immediate bed rest and careful
monitoring, with the understanding that any further physical stress could trigger premature labor with potentially fatal consequences. Emma's reaction to this diagnosis was a mixture of fear, guilt, and stubborn disbelief that her determination to maintain independence could have created such serious risks. The realization that her pride might have endangered the child she was carrying struck her with force that was almost physical, challenging every assumption she had made about strength and responsibility. Davidson's presence during Dr. Parker's examination and subsequent recommendations provided Emma with a sense of security that she had not realized she was missing. His quiet competence and obvious concern created an atmosphere where focusing on recovery seemed possible rather than merely necessary, suggesting that accepting help might represent wisdom rather than weakness. The afternoon brought a series of difficult conversations about Emma's immediate future and the changes that would be required to ensure her safety and that of her unborn child. Davidson's proposals were no longer suggestions to be considered, but necessities that circumstances had made unavoidable, transforming the dynamic between employer and employee into something more complex and personal. Emma's resistance to accepting the modified employment arrangements had been effectively eliminated by the morning's crisis, but her emotional adjustment to the new reality proved more challenging than simply agreeing to practical changes. The recognition that her independence had been an illusion that circumstances could shatter so easily was perhaps more painful than the physical symptoms that had forced the change. Grace Miller's role in managing Emma's transition to restricted activity was characterized by the firm kindness that frontier women applied to situations where sentiment could prove dangerous. Her insistence on complete bed rest was presented as non-negotiable medical necessity rather than personal preference, eliminating the possibility that Emma might continue to push against reasonable limitations. The evening brought Cole Davidson to Emma's bedside for a conversation that would prove pivotal in defining their future relationship. His manner was gentle but serious as he addressed the practical implications of her condition and the changes that would be required to ensure her continued safety and employment at Thunder Ridge Ranch. Davidson's explanation of the modified work arrangements he was proposing went beyond mere accommodation for physical limitations to encompass a complete restructuring of Emma's role at the ranch. The position he described would utilize her knowledge and skills while eliminating the physical demands that had proven so dangerous, creating sustainable employment that could continue throughout her pregnancy and beyond. The financial terms of the new arrangement were generous enough to ensure Emma's continued independence while acknowledging the reality that her productivity would necessarily be limited by her condition. Davidson's willingness to maintain her compensation despite reduced responsibilities reflected both business wisdom and personal concern in proportions that Emma found difficult to parse. Emma's acceptance of Davidson's proposals was delivered with gratitude that reflected both relief at having her immediate problems solved and recognition that her relationship with her employer had fundamentally changed. The crisis had stripped away the professional distance that had previously characterized their interactions, replacing it with a more personal connection based on mutual concern and shared vulnerability. The conversation continued with Davidson sharing insights into his own experience with loss and the lessons he had learned about the importance of accepting help when circumstances demanded it. His willingness to reveal personal vulnerabilities created an intimacy that went beyond mere employer-employee relations, suggesting that their connection was developing along lines that neither had initially anticipated. Emma's response to these revelations was complicated by her growing awareness that her feelings toward Davidson were becoming more complex than simple gratitude for employment opportunities. The combination of his obvious competence, his gentle concern for her welfare, and his willingness to share personal struggles created an attraction that added new dimensions to their already complicated relationship. The evening concluded with Emma finally accepting that her determination to maintain complete independence had been not only unrealistic but potentially dangerous for herself and her child. The crisis had taught her that some forms of strength required the wisdom to accept help when it was offered, and that true independence might mean making choices based on practical wisdom rather than abstract principles. Part 7. Reluctant Dependence. The days following Emma's medical crisis brought a profound shift in the rhythm and character of her life at Thunder Ridge Ranch. Confined to bed rest under Dr. Parker's strict orders, she found herself observing the ranch's operations from a new perspective that was both frustrating in its limitations and revealing in its insights. The enforced inactivity gave her unprecedented opportunity to notice details and patterns that had escaped her attention during the demanding days of physical labor. Grace Miller had taken personal responsibility for ensuring that Emma's recovery proceeded according to medical guidelines, a task that required constant vigilance against a patient who was naturally inclined toward activity and independence. The older woman's experience with stubborn invalids had taught her to anticipate attempts at premature resumption of normal activities, and she had developed strategies for maintaining necessary restrictions without creating an atmosphere of imprisonment. Emma's quarters had been rearranged to provide a view of the main stable area, allowing her to maintain visual connection with the horses that had been central to her work and identity at the ranch. This compromise between medical necessity and psychological need proved essential for maintaining her emotional equilibrium during a period when physical limitations threatened to overwhelm her sense of purpose and usefulness. The modified work arrangements that Cole Davidson had proposed began to take shape as Emma's condition stabilized and her ability to concentrate returned. The tasks assigned to her were carefully selected to utilize her knowledge and experience while eliminating any physical demands that might threaten her recovery. Record-keeping, correspondence, and planning activities provided mental stimulation while respecting the medical restrictions that governed her daily routine. Emma discovered that the administrative aspects of ranch management were far more complex and sophisticated than she had realized during her focus on direct animal care. The breeding program required detailed documentation that tracked not only individual animals but also broader patterns and trends that informed long-term strategic decisions. Her growing involvement in these activities provided new appreciation for the intellectual demands of successful ranch operation. Davidson's daily visits to check on Emma's progress and discuss work matters became a highlight of her restricted routine, providing both professional engagement and personal connection that made the enforced inactivity more bearable. His manner during these conversations was carefully balanced between employer concern and personal interest, maintaining appropriate boundaries while acknowledging the growing complexity of their relationship. The conversations revealed depths to Davidson's character that had not been apparent during their earlier, more formal interactions. His knowledge extended far beyond horse breeding to encompass literature, politics, and philosophy, suggesting an education and intellectual curiosity that were unusual among frontier ranchers. These discoveries added new dimensions to Emma's growing attraction to a man who had initially impressed her primarily through his professional competence. Emma's work on ranch correspondence brought her into contact with a network of business relationships that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of Thunder Ridge. Letters from horse buyers, breeding consultants, and industry publications revealed Davidson's reputation and influence within a community of professionals who valued his expertise and sought his advice on complex matters. The financial records that formed part of Emma's new responsibilities provided insight into the ranch's prosperity and the careful management that had created such success. Davidson's approach to business was conservative but strategic, building long-term value rather than pursuing quick profits that might compromise future opportunities. His willingness to invest in quality facilities and employee welfare was reflected in financial decisions that prioritized sustainable growth over maximum short-term returns. Emma's growing familiarity with the ranch's operations revealed the extent to which her employer had created something far more significant than a simple business enterprise. Thunder Ridge represented a complete community with its own social structures, economic relationships, and cultural values that distinguished it from the more common frontier operations that focused solely on immediate profit extraction. The other ranch employees' responses to Emma's changed circumstances provided evidence of the respect and concern she had earned during her brief tenure in direct animal care. Regular visits from co-workers who brought news, shared observations, and sought her advice on animal health matters demonstrated that her knowledge and opinions were valued regardless of her current physical limitations. Tom Bennett's daily reports on the breeding program's progress included detailed discussions of decisions and developments that kept Emma connected to the work that had defined her identity at Thunder Ridge. His willingness to seek her input on complex situations reflected both professional respect and personal friendship that had developed despite the relatively short duration of their working relationship. The mare whose difficult delivery had precipitated Emma's crisis recovered successfully, producing a healthy foal that would become an important addition to the ranch's breeding program. Emma's critical role in saving both animals was acknowledged by everyone involved, providing validation that her knowledge and skills had made genuine contributions to Thunder Ridge's success despite the personal cost of applying them. Dr. Parker's weekly examinations provided regular assessment of Emma's recovery progress and adjustment of activity restrictions based on her improving condition. His initial prognosis had been cautious, but the combination of complete rest and proper nutrition was producing the kind of steady improvement that suggested a positive outcome for both mother and child. The physician's conversations with Emma during these visits revealed his appreciation for her intelligence and practical knowledge of medical matters, qualities that were rare among his frontier patients. His willingness to explain the medical principles underlying his treatment recommendations reflected respect for her ability to understand and cooperate with complex therapeutic regimens. Emma's pregnancy had progressed to the point where the baby's movements were strong enough to be easily felt and observed, providing daily reassurance that her child was developing normally despite the earlier complications. These moments of connection with her unborn child helped maintain her emotional equilibrium during a period when physical limitations might otherwise have led to depression or despair. The approaching winter created additional considerations for Emma's future planning, as Montana's severe weather would make travel difficult and potentially dangerous during the final stages of her pregnancy. Davidson's suggestions about remaining at Thunder Ridge through the winter months were presented as practical necessity rather than charity, though Emma recognized the generosity underlying arrangements that would ensure her safety and comfort. Grace Miller's experience with frontier childbirth provided Emma with practical education about what to expect during delivery and the early weeks of motherhood. The older woman's frank discussions of both challenges and rewards helped prepare Emma for realities that were very different from the romanticized notions of motherhood that prevailed in more settled communities. The ranch's library, which Emma had discovered during her restricted activity period, contained an impressive collection of books that reflected Davidson's broad intellectual interests and commitment to continuing education.
Her access to literature, scientific journals, and historical works provided mental stimulation that helped compensate for the physical limitations that defined her current existence. Emma's correspondence duties brought her into contact with several other women who were involved in horse breeding operations throughout the region, revealing a network of female professionals who had found ways to participate meaningfully in an industry that was traditionally dominated by men. These connections provided both practical advice and emotional support from women who understood the unique challenges of frontier life. The ranch's economic success created an atmosphere of security and optimism that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and struggle that characterized many frontier enterprises. Emma's growing understanding of the financial stability that Davidson had created provided reassurance about her own future prospects and those of her child, regardless of how their personal relationship might develop. Davidson's management style emphasized collaboration and shared decision-making in ways that gave employees a sense of ownership and investment in the ranch's success. Emma's integration into this system through her administrative responsibilities provided her with influence and authority that extended far beyond what her formal job description might suggest. The approaching birth of her child created both anticipation and anxiety as Emma contemplated the challenges and responsibilities of single motherhood in frontier conditions. Davidson's repeated assurances of continued employment and support provided practical security, but the emotional complexities of raising a child without a father remained daunting despite the material advantages her position at Thunder Ridge would provide. Emma's evening conversations with Grace Miller often focused on practical aspects of child-rearing in frontier conditions, from basic health care to educational opportunities that might be available as the territory developed. The older woman's experience and wisdom provided guidance that helped Emma begin to envision a positive future for herself and her child. The ranch's social environment created opportunities for Emma to observe successful family relationships among employees who had managed to build stable home lives despite the challenges of frontier existence. These examples provided models for how she might structure her own family life in ways that would provide security and happiness for her child while maintaining her professional engagement with work that she found meaningful. As winter approached and Emma's pregnancy entered its final stage, the question of her long-term relationship with Cole Davidson remained unresolved but increasingly important. The practical arrangements that had begun as temporary accommodation for her medical needs were developing into something more permanent and complex, with implications that extended far beyond simple employment relationships. The growing emotional connection between Emma and Davidson was becoming apparent to other ranch employees who observed their interactions with the kind of interest that small communities naturally took in developing relationships. Grace Miller's occasional comments suggested that she both approved of the potential match and was prepared to provide whatever support might be needed to encourage its development. Emma's feelings about the possibility of a romantic relationship with Davidson were complicated by her gratitude for his support during her crisis and her uncertainty about whether her attraction was based on genuine compatibility or merely appreciation for his kindness during a vulnerable period. The question of whether she could distinguish between love and gratitude had become central to her thinking about their future together. Part 8. Growing Intimacy. The winter months at Thunder Ridge Ranch created an enforced intimacy that might not have developed under different circumstances. Snow that began falling in late November continued with such persistence that the outside world seemed to disappear, leaving the ranch community isolated but self-sufficient in ways that highlighted both its strengths and the deepening relationships among its members. Emma's quarters, originally intended as temporary accommodation, had been winterized and expanded to create a comfortable suite that could serve as both living space and nursery when her child arrived. The administrative work that had begun as accommodation for Emma's physical limitations had evolved into a central role in ranch operations that utilized her intelligence and organizational skills in ways that went far beyond simple record-keeping. Her correspondence with horse buyers, breeders, and industry contacts had become so extensive and sophisticated that Davidson increasingly relied on her judgment in matters that affected significant financial decisions and long-term strategic planning. Emma's pregnancy had progressed to the point where her condition was unmistakable but had stabilized in ways that allowed her to maintain an active intellectual engagement with ranch operations despite continued physical restrictions. Dr. Parker's monthly visits confirmed that both mother and child were thriving under the careful attention and proper nutrition that Thunder Ridge provided, suggesting that the remainder of her pregnancy would proceed without the complications that had threatened earlier stability. The enforced proximity of winter conditions meant that Emma and Cole Davidson spent increasing amounts of time together, working on ranch business but also engaging in conversations that revealed the depth and complexity of their individual characters. These discussions ranged from immediate practical concerns to broader philosophical questions about life, work, and the future they were building together at Thunder Ridge. Davidson's education and intellectual curiosity had been shaped by experiences that extended far beyond his current role as a successful rancher. His years of military service had exposed him to different regions and cultures, while his business relationships had brought him into contact with sophisticated urban markets that demanded understanding of complex economic and social trends. Emma discovered that her employer was as comfortable discussing literature and politics as he was evaluating horse bloodlines or market conditions. The conversations that developed during long winter evenings revealed that Emma's own intellectual interests and capabilities were more extensive than her circumstances had previously allowed her to demonstrate. Her marriage to Daniel had included discussions of books, ideas, and plans that had stimulated her thinking in ways that frontier life rarely provided. Davidson's willingness to engage with her ideas and seek her opinions created an intellectual partnership that complemented their growing professional collaboration. Emma's role in managing ranch correspondence had evolved to include significant decision-making authority that reflected Davidson's confidence in her judgment and business acumen. Her letters to potential customers and industry contacts were written under her own signature, establishing her as a recognized authority whose opinions carried weight in professional circles that extended far beyond Thunder Ridge. The ranch's isolation during severe weather periods created opportunities for extended conversations that might not have occurred under normal circumstances. Emma and Davidson found themselves spending hours discussing topics that ranged from immediate ranch concerns to broader questions about territorial development, family life, and the kind of future they hoped to build for themselves and subsequent generations. These conversations gradually revealed the extent to which both Emma and Davidson had been shaped by loss and the strategies they had developed for protecting themselves against further emotional injury. Emma's experience with Daniel's sudden death had taught her to value present happiness while remaining aware that circumstances could change without warning. Davidson's loss of his wife Catherine had created similar awareness combined with determination to honor her memory while remaining open to new possibilities. The approaching birth of Emma's child had become a source of anticipation that was shared throughout the ranch community. Grace Miller had taken charge of preparations with the efficiency that characterized her approach to all domestic challenges, creating a nursery and assembling supplies that would ensure proper care for both mother and infant during the critical early weeks. Davidson's involvement in these preparations went beyond what might be expected from an employer, reflecting personal investment in the welfare of both Emma and her child that suggested his feelings had developed far beyond professional concern. His attention to details and willingness to spare no expense in ensuring optimal conditions revealed the depth of his commitment to their well-being. Emma's awareness that Davidson was treating her child as if it were his own created complex emotions that combined gratitude with uncertainty about the implications of such involvement. The question of whether his interest was based on genuine paternal feelings or simply generous concern for an employee's welfare remained unresolved but increasingly important as the birth approached. The ranch's economic success during Emma's tenure had been enhanced by her contributions in ways that made her feel genuinely valuable rather than merely accommodated. Her work on breeding records, customer relationships, and strategic planning had produced measurable improvements in both efficiency and profitability that justified Davidson's investment in her employment regardless of any personal considerations. The professional respect that Emma had earned among ranch employees and industry contacts provided her with confidence and authority that extended beyond her specific responsibilities. Her opinions were sought on matters ranging from individual animal care to broader policy decisions, creating a role that was both influential and personally satisfying. Emma's correspondence with other women involved in horse breeding operations had revealed a network of professional relationships that provided both practical support and social connection during her isolation at Thunder Ridge. These women understood the unique challenges of combining motherhood with meaningful career involvement in ways that offered models for how Emma might structure her own future. Dr. Parker's assessment of Emma's condition during his December visit was entirely positive, confirming that the remaining weeks of her pregnancy should proceed normally under the careful conditions that Thunder Ridge provided. His confidence in the outcome helped alleviate anxiety, while his practical preparations for the delivery ensured that appropriate medical support would be available when needed. The ranch's holiday celebrations created opportunities for Emma to observe the community that had become her home and to appreciate the unusual combination of professional competence and personal warmth that characterized relationships among employees. The festivities were modest but genuine, reflecting values that emphasized substance over show in ways that appealed to Emma's practical nature. Davidson's gift to Emma during the Christmas season was a collection of books about child rearing and education that reflected both thoughtfulness and long-term planning for her child's development. The selection included works by leading authorities on childhood development, as well as practical guides that would be useful in frontier conditions where formal educational resources were limited. Emma's gift to Davidson was a detailed analysis of breeding program improvements that could enhance the ranch's long-term profitability while maintaining its reputation for quality. The document represented months of careful research and analysis that demonstrated her commitment to Thunder Ridge's success and her ability to contribute meaningfully to its future development. The exchange of gifts created an acknowledgement that their relationship had developed beyond simple employer-employee interactions to encompass mutual care and long-term commitment that neither had explicitly defined, but both clearly felt. The practical nature of both gifts reflected their shared values, while the thoughtfulness involved suggested deeper emotional investment. Emma's final month of pregnancy was characterized by increasing anticipation combined with confidence that she was surrounded by people who would provide whatever support she and her child might need. The ranch community's investment in her welfare had created a network of care that extended far beyond what she could have achieved through individual effort alone. Davidson's presence had become a daily source of security and companionship that Emma had come to depend upon in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. His obvious concern for her welfare and that of her child, combined with his gentle treatment of her changing condition, had created an intimacy that was both comforting and slightly overwhelming. The question of what would happen after her child's birth remained unresolved but no longer seemed threatening, as Emma had come to trust that Davidson's generosity and planning would ensure appropriate arrangements regardless of how their personal relationship might develop. The security this provided allowed her to focus on preparing for motherhood rather than worrying about practical survival. Grace Miller's excitement about the approaching birth reflected her own maternal instincts as well as her affection for Emma and approval of the way Davidson had handled the entire situation. The older woman's experience with childbirth and infant care provided practical preparation, while her emotional support created confidence that the transition to motherhood would be manageable. As January approached and Emma's delivery date drew near, the ranch community was unified in anticipation of welcoming its newest member. The preparations were complete, the medical arrangements were in place, and the emotional support was abundant, creating conditions that suggested both mother and child would thrive in their new life at Thunder Ridge Ranch. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out,